Hello there, welcome back to the channel, and we're going to be exploring and evaluating one of the most deadly and powerful vessels in the galaxy in the 23rd century, and that is the Shadow Vessel, the Shadow Battle Crab, whatever you want to call it, the great dark hand that comes out from the abyss and simply obliterates all in its path, the living darkness that was the Shadow Vessels. Before we get started, like, share, and subscribe if you like this content. There is more on this channel extensively on various different science fiction franchises. With that said, let's get into it. Okay, so a little history. Who exactly were the Shadows? Their actual name was over 10,000 letters long and was unpronounceable by most sentient species, at least in a verbal way. And I have a whole thought process on that, which, their name 10,000 letters is ridiculous, so there has to be more to it. From a human standpoint, it must be more descriptive or emotive or something. Doesn't really matter. The Shadows, how they were generally known by most races, were a race dedicated to the concept of evolution through conflict. They were one of the most ancient races in the galaxy, dating back millions of years. Guided by the much older first ones that had come before them, they themselves stayed behind when the other races went to the rim, but they were ideologically opposed to the other sort of babysitter race that stayed behind, the Vorlons, who believed in order, while the Shadows believed in chaos, to put it in its most simplistic terms. But both these races were phenomenally advanced. The Shadows, who use in-universe descriptors, would come along and kick over all the anthills to make them get rebuilt even stronger. Noting that 1,000 years before the events of the Great Shadow War, the last time they'd done this, the Minbari had emerged from that war stronger and more powerful than ever. At first, their motives seemed very irrational. They'd get races to fight one another, they'd make allies of some, enemies of others. Their goal was to prop up the strong, to weed out the weak, both within a species and perhaps the entire species completely, so that, as with every generation, a race would simply grow stronger. But they believed that without help, this would kind of stagnate, so they were trying to prove to the Vorlons and everyone else that their way was the right way. And what they would do is they'd go to sleep, effectively, for thousands and thousands of years. And then, say, every 10,000 years or so, realistically, I think that time period would have to be much bigger, but let's say it, they'd come along, start a load of wars, do these nonsensical battles, and then probably vanish again. Their objective was not to rule or dominate these races, although some races like the Drakh, the Centauri, and yes, the humans, all would work with them very closely. They didn't really rule any of these races. The Shadows are not an empire in a traditional sense. Physiologically, a shadow was a sort of spider-like creature, and their technology, architecture, and ships kind of reflected this sort of aesthetic. But their vessels themselves, to put them in perspective, were massive ships. Some of the biggest vessels around, not the biggest, but certainly very large. They had no distinctive features other than their spider-like appearance. If you actually look at the hull, there's no obvious engines, there's no windows, there's nothing that looks immediately like it's a weapon system, a sensor array, of communications, nothing. They shimmer in and out of normal space, although they can utilize jump gates if they really had a mind to. They enter in and out of hyperspace via this sort of shimmering, and travel their own beacons and are able to navigate it in ways we can't understand. The vessels themselves are extremely powerful, though interestingly only shown to demonstrate the use of a single weapon. The only other time they fire any other kind of energy-based projectile is one time when they destabilize a jump point using some kind of energy burst. Other than that, and the general abilities to prevent like lock-on and things on their hulls, and their ability to absorb a massive amount of damage, requiring a huge concentration of energy to even hurt one of these ships, with the capital weapons of basically the most powerful races only just managing to basically scratch them. They only really needed this one. It was a sort of cutting beam that was seen to be able to slice space stations and starships in two in a single shot, penetrate any known defense. The vessels themselves were very maneuverable and very fast and capable of experiencing very high pressures. One was seen to be destroyed, penetrating deep into the Jovian atmosphere. This vessel was not fully operational and was kind of out of control, being controlled by an unstable bonding, and we'll get to that in just a second. The actual vessels at full strength I don't think would have suffered the same problem, but certainly they have a limit like anything. They are constructed of a biomechanical material. How they are built or grown is not known, but they also contain multiple small bioorganic fighters. Whether or not these are automated craft or also bonded in some way is never explained, but considering how advanced and old the Shadows are, it wouldn't surprise me if these were some kind of drone and the ship could simply fire them out in this sort of like little egg nest, which is kind of what it looks like a spider's egg. It bursts apart like a spider's egg, releasing lots of these little fighters that go around and they fire an energy pulse rather than a beam. It is far less powerful, of course, than the main gun on the capital ship, but is more than capable of tearing apart the ships of all the major races, including the Minbari. The Shadows are simply that much more advanced than everybody. Now, get back to the bonding. The way these ships are controlled is they utilize a sentient being as part of their control matrix. Basically, the ship's computer is controlled by a sentient being that is merged with the ship after undergoing various cyber-organic conditioning to make them compatible with the technology. Shadow vessels were vulnerable only in one way, to a telepath, which they seemed to be able to sense the presence of even if they weren't aware of it. So they knew if there was a telepath aboard a ship. The only instance of a shadow vessel seen to retreat in the early stages of the conflict was when it sensed a human telepath aboard one of the White Stars. And the vessel retreated, although likely if it had known that the crew of the White Star didn't know that that telepath could be used as a weapon, they could have got away with destroying that ship and probably ultimately won the war. They'd have taken out the resistance leadership in one shot. Ultimately, the ships were vulnerable to telepaths. One known counter to this was to use a telepath as the central control matrix of the ship to try and counter it. But the Shadows seemed to hit on this idea a bit late on in the war and were not able to fully implement it across their fleet, if at all. These vessels were the mainstay of the Shadow fleet, giving them an incredibly advanced and intimidating backbone to their overall navy. How old these ships are is also debatable. Shadow tech seems to have stagnated a little bit. They probably do still build them because we know that much of their fleet was destroyed 1,000 years earlier in the last Great Shadow War, and they had to rearm slowly. But these ships simply don't require numbers to really win. The Shadows were not in it for conquest and annexation of territory. They were in it to cause chaos, to cause wars. Simple. And it was that end. The Shadows themselves also utilize advanced stealth technology, types of cloak, which the Shadows themselves are seen to utilize somehow, and it's plausible that the vessels utilize it as well. They are difficult to detect and lock onto with conventional sensors, generally reflecting it. One notable element of the ships is a screech that they let out as well. It is described when the vessels are first bonded as if something great, dark, and terrible has just been born. A sort of blood-curdling scream the vessels let out. This scream is heard even in a vacuum of space, indicating it's not a sound wave, but is some kind of telepathic transmission from the ship. It is psychological, much like the wail of a Stuka dive bomber or the sort of screech of the engines from a TIE fighter. This is designed to scare the enemy, intimidate them, make their blood run cold, make you feel like someone just walked over your grave. It's a psychological element to the ship. In fact, the entire appearance of the vessel, I would wager, is a psychological warfare tactic in and of itself. The appearance of a spider, the innate fears that most races have of creatures that that might be dangerous or venomous or poisonous that likely exist on many of the worlds across the galaxy, instills an innate fear. The vessel's simple black coloration, lack of defining characteristics other than its, again, spider-like appearance. Basically, there's a main hard central body of the ship, and then a series of spikes that stick out from it, which actually, the purpose of these is completely unknown. The main weapon of the ship, as I said, is very powerful, but is also very versatile. It's seen to be able to dig out other shadow vessels that are dug in the ground, as well as cut ships in half. Bottom line, these ships are amongst the most powerful and feared ships in the history of the galaxy, controlled by one of the most dangerous and aggressive species known to exist. The shadow vessels legitimately struck fear into their enemies. Despite the fact that some of them were occasionally destroyed and defeated, they were never really defeated in a straight fight by any of the younger races. Even the Minbari and the Centauri, who were two of the older ones, couldn't really harm them. Not on their own. They needed help from the Vorlons and later from using trickery and tactics to really overwhelm them. The vessels were capable and usually did do this. If one of the vessels was damaged, they would simply attach themselves to it and pull the vessel away and shimmer back off into hyperspace. Their original homeworld where these things were created was a planet known as Zahadum, and the Shadows were awoken allegedly by the presence of an Earth vessel called the Icarus that went there on a survey mission. It's said to have disturbed the Shadows and woke them up, but whether or not they'd actually woke them or simply discovered the Shadows as they were stirring to get ready for the next conflict is, again, something that you'd have to look at more closely, but isn't really inside the scope of this video. The vessels, bottom line, immensely powerful, incredibly dangerous, and they were the mainstay of the Shadow fleet. These incredibly powerful, dangerous, lethal starships spread themselves out across the galaxy, kicking over all the anthills and starting wars, and were pretty much invulnerable to everything that anyone threw at them, and were, although only lightly armed, were smartly armed and defended additionally by lots of little fighters that made up for the fact that they didn't have multi-targeting systems. As when you watch these things try and take on fighters, they do struggle a little bit in that they can't take them out very quick because they have to keep redirecting this single weapon to keep shooting at small, and they're more than capable of hitting them and destroying them in a single shot, but it does take more time, which is something of a weakness that can be exploited. You can basically swarm the ship, but this more increases the likelihood that you'll just drag out the battle and increases maybe the survivability of a few of the fighters over actually standing a chance of winning because none of your weapons can really hurt them. But that is the Shadow vessel. These ships, again, they're ancient, incredibly powerful, and some of their technology was actually adapted by the Earth Alliance, the Drakh, the Centauri, and utilized in various nefarious ways. It was said that basically nothing good can ever come from Shadow tech. It was inherently evil, for lack of a better term, but nonetheless an incredibly advanced and impressive starship that stood the test of time and for millions of years kept the Shadows at peak technological supremacy in the galaxy, although again that's debatable as to exactly how old these things are, but they were definitely around for many thousands upon thousands of years. Let me know in the comment section below what you think of these ships and their abilities, and the Shadows overall as an antagonist. And also with the recent news of Babylon 5's return, would you want to see a new story involving the Shadows? And do you think that maybe these ships could use a bit of an update? Because in my personal opinion, I was never a huge fan of the sort of spider aesthetic, and just having the one gun did seem a little off to me, but that's my opinion. Let me know yours in the comment section below.